Howdy everyone, and here it is as I promised. Well, I never promised actually, but here it is anyway. A group test of 4 of the most popular fast standard zoom lenses out there. If you've outgrown a standard kit lens that came with your camera, then you'll find that one of these lenses will make a great upgrade. They all have about the same zoom range as your standard kit lens, from wide angle to short telephoto, hence the name standard zoom lens. But they all let in much more light than a kit lens, which means they're better for low light photography and for getting lovely out of focus backgrounds. Fast standard zoom lenses are the bread and butter lenses for professional photographers because their fast f2.8 maximum apertures let in lots of light and blur out your background better. They have a long enough zoom range to be useful in all kinds of settings, but they don't have such a long zoom range that the picture quality suffers, like on a super zoom lens. Today I'll be taking a close look at the least expensive Tamron 17-50mm f2.8 VC lens, the slightly more expensive Sigma 17-50mm f2.8 OS HSM lens, the even more expensive Sigma 18-35mm f1.8 HSM lens, and the very expensive Canon 17-55mm f2.8 IS USM lens. The 3 f2.8 lenses let in almost twice as much light as your kit lens at their widest angles and 4 times as much light when they're zoomed in, with a background that's correspondingly 2 to 4 times blurrier. They also all have image stabilization to help keep your image still while doing video work and to make your still pictures sharper. You may have noticed that one lens here is the odd one out, but I decided to include it anyway. The new Sigma 18-35mm f1.8. It has a much shorter zoom range than the others, and it has no image stabilization, as well as being pretty big and heavy. But it lets in over twice as much light again as the other 3 lenses, and gives an even more out of focus background, which makes it a bit revolutionary. So I'm sure a lot of you will be interested to see how it compares. First, let's look at the build quality. The Tamron lens is built okay, better than a typical kit lens, but it still feels a bit plasticky. The zoom ring works nice and smoothly. The focus ring is a tiny bit sticky, which is annoying, and it has a really short focus path which makes precise focusing pretty difficult. You can't turn the focus ring without switching the lens off autofocus. Well, you can try and force it if you really want to, but you'll probably just damage the motor. The autofocus motor itself is quite fast, but it also makes noise as it goes along. It's an autofocus system that's a bit old hat these days, but hey, this is the cheap option, and it does the job okay. The Sigma 17-50mm f2.8 OS has slightly nicer build quality, and it's the smallest of all 4 lenses. The zoom ring is not the smoothest in the world, but the focus ring is a little smoother than the Tamron, and the HSM autofocus motor is silent, rather than making a noise like the Tamron does. However, you also have to switch it autofocus in order to turn the focus ring, which again is a little old-fashioned these days. So there's slightly better build quality here. The Sigma 18-35 f1.8 handles like a boss. The lens is big and heavy, but it's a pleasure to use. It's tightly constructed out of metal and rubber, and it looks the business too. The zoom ring and the focus ring are ultra smooth and well damped, and you can turn the focus ring anytime, even if the lens is set to autofocus, so that's another professional touch. The autofocus motor is quite fast and also silent. This lens is clearly on a different level to the others. Finally, the very expensive Canon 17-55mm f2.8 IS USM. This lens is pretty oversized, but at least it's not quite as heavy as the Sigma 18-35. It's still pretty big against the other f2.8 lenses though. Its focus ring is a little smoother than the other f2.8 lenses, but nowhere near as nice as the Sigma 18-35. It also has an excellent full-time manual focus ring, which is very smooth and has just the right amount of travel for video work. The autofocus is super fast and silent. The image stabilization is subtly different on all three of the image stabilized lenses. On all three, the image stabilization is very good for stills work, but they're all slightly noisy and slightly jerky when you're panning around during video work, except for the Tamron lens, which is quieter and smoother as you're panning around. For video work, I would prefer the image stabilization of the Tamron lens, but for normal photography, they'll all be as good as each other. Overall, I think the Sigma 18-35 f1.8 clearly has the best build quality, but sadly, it doesn't have image stabilization. The Canon 17-55mm is also fantastic, the best out of the other three lenses with image stabilization. The Sigma 17-50mm OS is built okay, and it's a nicely smaller size. The Tamron lens is also built okay, but it has the most old-fashioned autofocus motor. Now let's look at image quality. I'm testing all these lenses on my Canon 60D with its 18-megapixel image sensor. Let's start with these four at their widest angles and widest apertures. If we look closely at my test picture, we can see that they're all nice and sharp in the middle of the image. So let's look in the corners. The less expensive Tamron lens does very well indeed in the corners, and the Sigma 17-50 is just slightly less sharp. The Canon 17-55 is about as sharp as the Tamron, which is a surprise considering how much more money it costs. The Sigma 18-35 is also very sharp, even though its aperture is much wider than the others at f1.8. Normally, most lenses are quite soft at f1.8, so it's very impressive. And if we stop it down to f2.8 to make the test fair, the Sigma 18-35 beats the other three lenses hands down. So in terms of sharpness, at 18mm, the Sigma 18-35mm rules. The Canon lens and Tamron lenses come second, with the Sigma 17-50mm OS a close third. When we stop all the lenses down to f4, we see that they all become about as sharp as each other. All four lenses, sadly, suffer from chromatic aberration at their widest angles. You can probably see some colour fringing on contrasting edges. Interestingly, they all seem to be affected to about the same level. So I'd say that at 17mm, all four lenses perform very similarly indeed. Okay, let's zoom in just over halfway to 35mm. This is as far as the Sigma 18-35mm will go. We'll start by looking at the picture quality at the lens's maximum apertures. Again, when we look closely at the test picture, they're all very sharp in the middle, but the Canon 17-55 seems to reach an excellent sharpness level, which the other three can't quite touch. But if we stop the Sigma 18-35mm down to f2.8 to make things fair, we see that it's equally sharp, leaving the Tamron lens slightly behind. Now let's look in the corners of the image. Just for now, I'll open up the Sigma 18-35mm aperture back to f1.8. In the corners, again, the Canon lens is the sharpest, with the Sigma 18-35mm a very close second. I would say that the Sigma 17-50mm OS is a very close third, whereas the Tamron lens seems a bit soft. But again, this isn't completely fair because the Sigma 18-35 is still at f1.8. If we stop the Sigma 18-35mm down to f2.8, the same aperture as the others, then again, it has the others for breakfast, being very sharp indeed. If we stop all four lenses down to f4, then the softer lenses see a major increase in sharpness, and all four are performing very well. Although again, looking closely, I'd give the edge to the Canon and the Sigma 18-35. None of the lenses seem to have any problems with chromatic aberration, all of them giving very clean images. Okay, let's zoom all the way in to 50 and 55mm. The three f2.8 lenses can breathe a bit of a sigh of relief at this point, because this is where we say goodbye to the Sigma 18-35mm with its narrow zoom range but amazing picture quality. Let's take a close look at the image quality at f2.8. In the centre of the images, if we look closely, the Canon and Sigma lenses seem to be the sharpest, turning in fantastic performances. The Tamron lens comes last. It's noticeably soft, and the contrast levels are pretty low, which is disappointing. Let's look in the corners then. The Canon and Sigma lenses determinedly hold on to that excellent picture quality, being nice and sharp. Unfortunately, we do see a little chromatic aberration in the windows on the Canon picture. The Tamron lens disappoints, being the softest of all three by a wide margin with the worst contrast. If we stop our apertures down to f4, then the Canon and Sigma lenses become equally sharp, turning in great performances. The Tamron lens has definitely improved, but it still drags its feet behind the other two. Phew, okay, that took me a long time to put together and edit. Let's draw some conclusions about image quality. I would say the lens with the best image quality is clearly the Sigma 18-35mm f1.8. It's just astonishingly good. You could say it has an advantage because it doesn't have to be designed to go up to 50mm like the other lenses. But it's also at a big disadvantage because it was designed to have a much faster maximum aperture, so all in all, the Sigma 18-35 is clearly the best. The Canon lens and the Sigma 17-50 OS are a close second. It's hard to give either of them a clear edge over the other. I'd say that the Canon lens is slightly sharper, but the Sigma has less chromatic aberration. So if you want that extra zoom range and image stabilization, and you need the absolute best build quality and slightly better image quality, and you have a lot of spare money, go for the Canon. However, the Sigma 17-50mm is basically as good as the Canon lens and sells for much less money, about half as much. Out of these four lenses, the Sigma 17-50 is the sharpest for the money you pay. The Tamron lens, however, is a disappointment. It only costs a little less money than the Sigma 17-55mm lens, but there's a big difference in picture quality. The Tamron 17-50 would still be good enough for video work, but I wouldn't like to use it for still pictures. Well, sharpness isn't everything. Let's look at some other optical issues. When it comes to image distortion, all four lenses have barrel distortion at their widest angles. I hate barrel distortion. It's a pain to correct during editing and even harder if you're editing video. You can see it here as curving on straight lines. The Canon lens and the Sigma 18-35 have the least barrel distortion, turning in comparatively respectable performances for a zoom lens. The Sigma 17-50mm and the Tamron lens, however, are slightly worse than average, with much more noticeable distortion. The distortion on all four lenses goes away to about the same extent when you zoom in. It's only at these wider angles that you see any difference. They all have about the same level of vignetting or darkness in the corners. When it comes to the quality of these lenses' bokeh, or the out-of-focus backgrounds, well, that's a thing of personal taste, but I'll give you my thoughts anyway. The Tamron 17-50 has backgrounds which are slightly nervous and busy looking, which is another black mark in my book. The Canon 17-55 is up and down. Often it looks nice enough, but it can also struggle with slightly ugly highlighting from time to time. I think the Canon is fine, but other people don't like it so much. The Sigma lenses, like most Sigma lenses, have very nice bokeh, with backgrounds that look nice and soft and smooth like they should do. They both do a great job. If you're one of those photographers who's obsessed with nice quality bokeh, you'll never go far wrong with any Sigma lens really. Although in this case, I'd say the Sigma 18-35 f1.8 is probably the best if you really need a nice out-of-focus background because it has the wider aperture. I'm gonna wrap this all up now, as this is turning into the longest camera lens video I've ever made, and it's taken me absolutely ages to pick together. So I've written out this chart for you all, which is pretty self-explanatory. You can pause the video here for a look, if you like. In terms of build quality, the Sigma 18-35mm and the Canon 17-55 are my favourites, although they are both pretty big lenses. The Sigma gets bonus marks for having a metal body and amazing zoom and focus rings. The Tamron is fine, but it has the worst autofocus system. In terms of image quality, the Sigma 18-35mm f1.8 is the winner. But between the other three, which all have image stabilization and longer zoom ranges, the Canon 17-55mm f2.8 rules the roost. But the Sigma 17-50 is only a tiny bit behind, and considering it only costs around half as much, it's offering the best value for money by a long way. The Tamron 17-50 f2.8 VC is way behind the others, so as I said, it would be fine for video work but poor for still photography. Frankly, you'd be just as well off with your kit lens if you're looking at sharpness. Overall, I'd say that the Canon 17-55 and the Sigma 18-35 win out, but they're also pretty expensive lenses. If you want the best, then it's between those two, and it's up to you to figure out whether you want the zoom range and image stabilization of the Canon lens or the much wider aperture and amazing picture quality of the Sigma. Either way, those two are the best. But the best value lens is easily the Sigma 17-50mm f2.8 OS. It's come down in price to the point where it's not an expensive lens at all, and the very good image quality it offers really makes it a bargain. If you're looking to upgrade from your kit lens, or you want a really nice lens for video work and you don't have a lot of money, or you just want good value, then I can wholeheartedly recommend the Sigma 17-50 OS. It's a very good lens and simply great value for money. And sadly, the Tamron lens comes in last place. I normally like Tamron lenses, so this was disappointing. It's the cheapest lens, but the least satisfying to use. It would be a very good value lens for video work, but frankly, it's not much less expensive than a Sigma 17-50 OS, so I think you'd be better off saving a little more for that instead. Well done for watching all the way through. These are of course just my opinions, feel free to disagree or let me know what you think in the comments section. If you'd like to see more detailed reviews of all these lenses, which includes their performances close up and in working against bright light, and with more sample videos and pictures, then click on the links in the video or the links in the description. Enjoy making your mind up, whatever you decide.